Sure, thanks for joining us. Can you tell us a bit about what the red paper land back is and why Yellowhead released it?
Yeah, of course. The red paper, it's our first red paper ever released, our inaugural red paper, and it's called Land Back. So we went right to the heart of the issue, and the paper is about how Canada dispossesses Indigenous people with a particular focus on First Nations of their lands, and in turn what Indigenous communities are doing to get that land back.
So, Shiri, despite Supreme Court victories like Chilcotin, the report points out that courts still favor government when it comes to conflict over land and resource development. Can you explain a little further?
Sure. Well, our report does do an overview of some of the big court cases being played out around Aboriginal rights and title, but I think one of the research findings that's really original that we produced in our report was an overview of injunctions being filed for by and against First Nations across the country. It's the first time anyone's ever tried to gauge what the situation is when resource conflicts end up in the courts through injunctions. And we found that overwhelmingly the courts decide in favor of companies and governments against Indigenous people in the case of resource conflicts. I think this is really significant because, first of all, injunctions do not allow for the court to appraise the full strength of claim of Indigenous people. They basically only have the tools to determine basically who has more significant economic loss, whose balance of convenience is more inconvenienced. And so with those very sort of basic tools, the courts tend to choose corporations because they can prove quantitatively that they're losing profits, whereas when Indigenous people point to their economic livelihoods based on their territories and waters, it's less persuasive for the courts.
How do the Crown and industry continue to dispossess Indigenous peoples from their land?
Well, we look at a range of forms of dispossession on a spectrum. So under the sort of form of dispossession that we call denial, we go right back to the doctrines of discovery and look at the whole concept of Crown land and the fact that Canada claims underlying title to all lands in this country as a basic form, as the first form and the foundational form of dispossession, because what the government is essentially saying is that they don't recognize any forms of Indigenous proprietary interest or jurisdiction, and the legal orders of governance that govern the lands, they don't recognize that at all. And so denial is the first form of dispossession, and it plays out in the way that Crown lands then use that underlying title to authorize all kinds of development, permitting, licensing, leasing, to do forestry, mining, hydro development, and so on. And in this way, it dispossesses Indigenous people in their ability to exercise jurisdiction on the land. But then we also look at different kinds of dispossession that we call recognition, where there's some recognition of Aboriginal rights, for example, through the duty to consult, that allow Indigenous people to exercise some measure of jurisdiction, for example, through resource revenue sharing agreements, either with private companies or with provinces and territorial governments, or with industry directly. But we argue that these are weaker forms of jurisdiction for a number of reasons. One is that they don't really give Indigenous people the right to determine whether or not they want to authorize that development. A lot of the sharing happens after the provinces already issue the permits, for example. And negotiating Aboriginal rights through these private legal contracts also leaves a lot to be desired. The legal contracts don't have the same kind of standing as court cases determined on through the Supreme Court of Canada or through international principles like free, prior, and informed consent. And so they're limited in their capacity to protect Indigenous land rights as well. They don't, for example, protect the proper title and rights holders as the decision makers.
So what are the consequences if nothing is done?
If the land isn't given back?
Right.
Well, we look at all kinds of models of reclamation that are happening across the country that give us a sense of what the potential is if land restitution were to take place in a meaningful way. And they're incredible stories that really, first of all, speak to the importance of Indigenous knowledge and law in protecting the land. In particular, we put this in a context of the climate crisis and look at how projects to restore governance, for example, over fisheries, over water bases, over everything from, the highest level of land management to smaller practices like control over permitting for mushroom picking, for example, in Tsilhqot'in territory. We look at the possibilities of what this country could look like if Indigenous people could exercise their jurisdiction without constant interruption by the federal and provincial governments.
Shiri, we'll have to leave it there, but I appreciate you joining us, and thanks for your work on this paper.
Thanks very much for having me.